So, back in 1793, the leaders of the French Revolution made this incredibly drastic decision. They basically decided that to truly free their citizens, they had to just, well, destroy absolutely everything from the past.
Right, a total blank slate.
Exactly. I mean, they didn't just overthrow the monarchy. They literally changed the clocks. They created this entirely new calendar with weeks that were 10 days long, just to erase the traditional Christian Sunday. They renamed all the months. It was like
Yeah.
they wanted to sever every single psychological anchor to the old world.
Yeah, which is an incredibly dangerous game to play.
It really is. Because just a few months later, that unconstrained pursuit of total freedom had morphed into the Reign of Terror. You had thousands of people losing their heads to the guillotine. And it really makes you wonder, why is it that the absolute pursuit of freedom almost always ends in tyranny? Like, why does every modern political or social argument feel like we are just fighting the exact same historical battles, just wearing different outfits?
Because it is the ultimate Groundhog Day of human civilization. I mean, we really think we were debating brand new problems today, right? Like artificial intelligence or global trade, social media algorithms. But we are really just relitigating the exact same structural anxieties that human beings have wrestled with since we first figured out how to build cities.
Since we learned to live together without instantly destroying one another.
Exactly.
And that is exactly what we are decoding today for you. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are looking at this brilliantly structured framework from our source material that maps out 10 fundamental political and philosophical tensions. And it views these tensions through the lenses of 10 distinct subpersonalities.
Right, we're talking about Addy, Mac, Kenny, Val, Liz, Tommy Kelly, Devin, Tira, and Bannock.
Yes, those 10. And our mission for this deep dive is to use these 10 lenses as sort of a shortcut. We want to bypass all the cultural noise to help you become profoundly well-informed on how power, society, and human identity actually work.
And, doing that requires a really massive paradigm shift in how we process conflict. The calm, insightful truth at the heart of the framework we're analyzing today is that none of these intense cultural or political debates are actually problems meant to be definitively solved.
Right, they aren't math equations.
No, not at all. There's no correct answer at the back of the book. They are permanent human tensions that simply have to be managed. And what's fascinating here is that each of these 10 subpersonalities perfectly encapsulates why human beings become so fiercely and sometimes violently loyal to their side of an argument.
Because they're trying to protect something, right?
Exactly. It's almost never because people are inherently evil. It's usually because they are desperately trying to protect something vital from being destroyed.
So before we introduce the first subpersonality, there's an analogy in the source that perfectly frames, well, everything we are going to explore. Think about tuning a guitar.
Oh, this is such a great way to look at it.
Right. Because if you have a guitar string and you leave it too loose, what do you actually get? You get chaos. The string is floppy. It's fragmented. If you pluck it, there's absolutely no resonance. It's just this dull, depressing thud.
It's completely useless as an instrument.
Exactly. But if you take that exact same string and you tighten it too much, like if you crank the peg until there is zero give, what happens?
It snaps.
It violently breaks from the immense pressure and that rigid conformity.
Which means the ultimate goal of a functioning society isn't to achieve some magical, frictionless 50-50 balance where everyone just holds hands and gets along. A guitar string with zero tension doesn't make a sound. The goal is a dynamic tension that actually produces music.
You literally need the opposing pull of both sides to create a functioning instrument. The pull itself is the point.
Is the point, yeah.
Okay, so let's start examining these strings, these core tensions holding us all together. We have to start at the bedrock, which is the core self. How do we view the individual human being? And this tension is represented by the subpersonality, Addy. Addy looks at the world entirely through the tension of the individual versus the collective.
This is perhaps the most foundational architectural beam of any civilization. If we look at Addy's framework, the individualist pole exists for a very specific structural purpose, which is to protect the person who does not fit.
It's a defense mechanism.
Exactly. Politically, this manifests as liberal rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial, property rights. It's this deeply held belief that the state or the mob cannot steamroll the individual just because it would be convenient for everyone else.
And the classic example here is the American tradition, specifically the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
When you actually look at the mechanics of it, it's a document literally designed to carve out protected, impenetrable zones of conscience and expression.
Right, like the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah, requiring a warrant before the police can search your house isn't just some bureaucratic hurdle. It's a profound philosophical statement that a human being has a physical and digital boundary that the collective is simply not allowed to breach. It gives the dissenter somewhere to stand.
But then we have the opposing pole. Addy's collectivist pole recognizes a totally different reality, which is that human beings are profoundly, unavoidably interdependent. We are not just isolated atoms floating in a void.
Right.
The collectivist argument is that freedom on its own doesn't automatically create fairness. Like, an entirely unregulated free market doesn't automatically generate human meaning, and it certainly doesn't ensure that the vulnerable survive.
To really understand the extremes here, let's look at ancient Sparta. Sparta is like the ultimate historical manifestation of the collective pole. In Sparta, personal freedom, your choice of career, your family life, none of it mattered at all.
It was entirely subsumed by the state.
Yeah. Through their educational system, the agos, boys were taken at age 7 and brutalized into becoming perfect soldiers. The state shaped the citizen entirely for the collective good of the city-state. Your individual desires were literally considered a threat to the survival of the group.
And we know collectivism can go to monstrous totalitarian extremes. 20th century fascist systems essentially argued that a person was only valuable as a cell within a larger racial or national organism. And if the cell didn't serve the organism, it was eradicated.
Just wiped out.
Yeah. But individualism can also go to debilitating extremes. Total individualism creates profound societal isolation, loneliness, and this sort of fragmentation where no one feels a duty to help their neighbor because everyone is solely responsible for themselves.
That actually brings us to what I think is one of the heaviest insights in Addy's lens. It's this central paradox. Every societal order claims to include everybody, but every order also decides what kind of self is easiest to include.
That is the invisible mechanism of culture right there. Let's really break down how that actually works. The individualist order heavily favors those who can compete alone. It optimizes the world for the self-reliant, the entrepreneurial, the hyper-competitive people who have the energy and the ruthlessness to thrive without a safety net.
So if you are a brilliant solitary inventor, the individualist order is a paradise for you.
Oh, absolutely. But the collective order favors a totally different human psychology. It favors those who conform. It elevates the organizer, the team player, the person who genuinely finds joy in subordinating their own ego for the success of the group.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, neither side is inherently purely evil or purely good. They're literally just optimizing the environment for different psychological profiles of human beings.
Exactly. And philosophers have gone to war over this exact distinction for centuries. On the individualist side, you have thinkers like John Rawls, who argued fiercely for prioritizing equal basic liberties and the moral standing of the individual above all else.
Right, the veil of ignorance.
Yes. His famous veil of ignorance thought experiment basically asks you to design a society without knowing where you will end up in it. You don't know if you'll be rich or poor, healthy or sick. And he argues that any rational person would prioritize individual rights to protect themselves from the worst-case scenario.
And I guess the extreme dramatization of that is Ayn Rand's philosophy, right? Look at a novel like The Fountainhead. Howard Roark is the ultimate individualist hero. He literally blows up a housing project he designed rather than allow the collective, the committee, to alter his pure individual vision. It's the creator fighting against conformist mediocrity.
But then on the other side, you have communitarian philosophers who push back really hard. They argue that Rawls and Rand are dealing in total fictions because people aren't just floating autonomous selves who fall out of the sky and make purely rational choices.
We're shaped by our environment.
Right. We are formed inside communities, languages, and traditions. If you strip away the collective, you don't actually liberate the individual. You just leave them completely untethered and devoid of identity.
Okay, I see the philosophical architecture here, but how does this actually play out when we try to build real-time rules for society? Because you can't just philosophize your way through a Tuesday, right? You need actual laws. And that brings us to the subpersonality, Mac. Okay, let's unpack this. Mac views the world through the lens of freedom versus authority. And there is an analogy here from the source that I am absolutely obsessed with. Think about a pickup basketball game.
It is honestly the perfect microcosm for how human beings interact.
Right, so imagine a group of people show up to play a pickup basketball game. If there are absolutely no rules, like no out of bounds, no traveling calls, no fouls, the game is completely ruined. It devolves into chaos, endless arguing, and eventually just physical violence. The absolute freedom to do whatever you want actually destroys the freedom to play basketball.
But flip the scenario. Imagine that exact same game, but you have a hyper-aggressive referee who blows the whistle every 5 seconds. They call every microscopic technicality, every slight brush of an arm, every minor foot shuffle.
Right, nobody wants to play that game.
No, the game is also completely ruined. It is suffocated by authority. The players just get frustrated and quit.
And this challenges the fundamental way most of us are taught to think about freedom in the West, because we intuitively define freedom as simply the absence of rules. We think, if the government leaves me alone, if my boss leaves me alone, I am free. But Mac's lens reveals something mechanistically different. Freedom isn't the absence of rules. It is the presence of good limits.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains exactly why democracies require constitutions. A constitution is an authority that limits freedom specifically in order to preserve it.
Let me throw an original analogy at you that I think builds on Mac's basketball game. Think of a river. If a river has no banks, it's not a river. It's just a swamp. The water spreads out everywhere. It loses all its momentum. It becomes stagnant, and it eventually just evaporates.
Wow, yeah.
The banks of the river, the physical constraints, the authority, the boundaries, those are actually what give the river its power, its direction, and its speed. You literally need the constraint to create the force.
That is a very Mac-aligned way to view structural power. In political philosophy, this tension is framed as the ultimate boss battle between John Stuart Mill and Thomas Hobbes.
Oh, let's get into this.
So Mill represents the profound fear of the cage. He argued that liberty should only be restricted to prevent direct physical harm to others. His nightmare was authority crushing individuality, preventing human experimentation, and essentially forcing everyone into a dull, homogeneous box.
So the fear of the referee blowing the whistle every 5 seconds.
Precisely. But Thomas Hobbes represents the fear of the riot. Hobbes was writing during the horrific bloodshed of the English Civil War. He looked at human nature stripped of authority and saw an absolute nightmare.
Nasty, brutish, and short.
Exactly. He famously described life in the state of nature, without a strong sovereign authority, as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He believed that total freedom just leads to a paranoid war of all against all, where everyone is constantly terrified of being murdered in their sleep. Therefore, we willingly surrender our total freedom to an authority, the Leviathan, just to secure peace.
So Mac's ultimate conclusion is a paradox that we really just have to sit with, right? Freedom without structure cannot protect itself. I mean, if you have a perfectly tolerant democracy with absolutely no laws or enforcement mechanisms, it will inevitably be overthrown by a small group of intolerant people willing to use physical force.
Yes, freedom requires an authoritarian mechanism like a police force or a military just to ensure it isn't conquered by someone else.
But the paradox is that authority without freedom forgets who it is supposed to protect in the first place. It turns into a machine that only cares about maintaining its own power. Like, the referee forgets that the point of the whistle is to facilitate the game, not to just listen to the sound of the whistle.
And that reality sets us up for the next massive complication. Because if we are playing this basketball game and we have established the banks of our river, we have agreed that we need some rules but not too many, how do we know when those rules have become obsolete? Like, how do we know when the game actually needs to change?
That shifts us directly into the realm of time and memory. How do societies navigate time? We look at this through the subpersonalities, Kenny and Val. Kenny's lens is stability versus change. And Kenny introduces a concept that I think explains almost every midlife crisis and political revolution in human history. It is the load-bearing paradox. The systems that protect you today will eventually become the exact systems that trap you tomorrow.
It is the inescapable life cycle of human organization. Everything we build eventually turns on us and left unchecked.
Let's make this super relatable for a second before we talk about geopolitics, because I experienced this exact paradox in my own life.
Oh, really?
Yeah. In college, I was taking a brutal course load and I was absolutely drowning. So to survive, I became hyper-organized. I built these color-coded spreadsheets for literally every hour of my day. It was a rigid system of stability, and it honestly saved my academic career. It protected me.
Okay, I can see where this is going.
Yeah, cut to 10 years later, I'm married, and I'm trying to put our relaxing Sunday morning pancake breakfasts into a spreadsheet with 15-minute time blocks. My spouse was losing their mind. The system that protected me in an environment of chaos became a cage that trapped me in an environment of intimacy.
That is exactly how it works on a macro civilizational scale. There is a deeply predictable cycle. It always starts with chaos. Because human beings are terrified of chaos, we are Hobbesian in that sense. We build a system to create order. We write laws, we build institutions, we establish currencies, and over time, that system works. It creates stability, and critically, it generates social trust. People rely on the system.
But then, time passes, the environment changes, a new technology is invented, or maybe a massive demographic shift happens.
And the system begins to stagnate because it was built for a reality that literally no longer exists. The bureaucratic rules that once ensured fairness now just create terrible bottlenecks. The system stops serving the people it was built to protect and starts reorganizing itself purely to protect the people running the system. It becomes totally self-serving.
So the pressure just builds and builds. People suffering under the stagnant system demand change.
Right.
And eventually, someone comes along to break the system. But breaking the system is terrifying, because if you break it too thoroughly, you fall right back into the chaos you started with.
Which perfectly maps onto how conservatives and progressives view the world today. This is where we see the profound danger of ideological tunnel vision. Conservatives typically focus their anxiety entirely on the fear of system collapse.
They don't want to break the low-bearing beams.
Right. They look at a society and see intricate, invisible webs of social trust, family structures, and economic supply chains, and they say, do not carelessly smash this because you have no idea how hard it was to build and you don't know how to rebuild it once it's gone.
But progressives look at the exact same society and fear system stagnation. They look at the marginalized people, the poverty, the outdated laws causing active harm, and they say, this system is cruel and obsolete. If we don't evolve and break these barriers, we are suffocating human potential.
And what's vital to understand here is that both sides are entirely correct about the specific danger they are focused on.
Wow. Yeah.
Yes, the conservative is right that collapse is horrific. The progressive is right that stagnation is suffocating. The mature Kenny-style synthesis here is not to just split the difference and do like half measures. It is to accurately diagnose what phase of the cycle we are currently in. The rule of thumb here is profound. You must be deeply conservative about what you destroy, but radically decisive about what you repair. You have to maintain the load-bearing beams of a society while aggressively replacing the rotten wood.
Okay, so Kenny deals with the actual mechanics of time, the laws and systems. But the subpersonality, Val takes this exact same tension and applies it to cultural time, like the soul of a society. Here's where it gets really interesting. Val's lens is tradition versus progress.
And Val's paradox is incredibly sharp, almost violent. Progress builds the future by dismantling parts of the past.
You cannot build a new building without tearing down the old one. You cannot plant a new crop without clearing the field. The historical contrasts here are just mind-blowing. Let's look at how societies actually navigate this. A brilliant example of successful strategic recombination is the Meiji Restoration in Japan during the late 19th century.
That is an absolute masterclass in managing Val's tension.
Right. Japan was facing intense global pressure. The West was arriving with these advanced warships and industrial technology. Japan realized that if they remained entirely traditional, they would be colonized and destroyed. They had to progress. They had to modernize their military, build factories, and overhaul their economy at a staggering speed.
But they didn't just throw everything away.
Exactly. Here is the genius part. They did it while fiercely protecting their cultural continuity. They elevated the emperor as a symbol of eternal Japanese identity to act as a psychological anchor while everything else around them changed. They basically modernized the hardware, but they protected the software.
Now, contrast that surgical approach with the French Revolution we talked about at the very beginning of the deep dive. The French Revolution is the ultimate example of progress becoming totally untethered from tradition. The revolutionaries didn't just want to reform a corrupt monarchy. They wanted to obliterate every single source of traditional legitimacy simultaneously.
They attacked the aristocracy, the church, the calendar, the system of weights and measures. They wanted a perfectly blank slate.
And when you create a truly blank slate, you erase all the social norms that constrain human violence. Without tradition to act as a stabilizing gravity, the revolution spiraled instantly into paranoia and mass execution. The Reign of Terror was the direct result of destroying the past way too quickly.
To make this even more accessible, think about the fictional nation of Wakanda in Marvel's Black Panther. It is a brilliant pop culture distillation of this exact tension. Wakanda is an incredibly advanced society, but they are paralyzed by the clash between Val's two poles. On one side, they're desperate to guard their inheritance. They stay hidden, maintain their monarchy, and protect their sacred traditions to ensure their own survival.
But on the other side, they are faced with the profound moral responsibility of progress. They have the technology to cure diseases and fight injustice globally, But doing so requires dismantling their tradition of isolationism. It requires stepping into the messy, dangerous future.
Let me test an analogy on you to see if it holds up. If tradition is the deep root system of an oak tree, providing nourishment and physical stability against the wind, and progress is the pruning, shears cutting away the dead, diseased branches so the tree can push its energy into growing new fruit. How do we actually know we aren't accidentally cutting the main artery? How does a society know when a tradition is just dead wood and when it is the very thing keeping the tree alive?
That is the million-dollar question, and the framework actually reveals a hidden symmetry in Val's logic that answers it. You have to understand what each side is secretly afraid of. Tradition is essentially fighting cultural death. It is the existential dread that we will forget who we are, that our shared meaning will evaporate, and we will just become rootless strangers to each other. Progress, however, is fighting personal death. It is the fear that individual human beings will be crushed, marginalized, or prevented from self-actualization by archaic, oppressive rules.
Wow, wait, really? Tradition fears losing the group's soul. Progress fears crushing the individual's soul.
Exactly. So the ultimate test for your pruning shears is this. Does a specific tradition carry living wisdom, or does it merely carry dead power?
Can you explain the mechanics of that? What is the actual difference?
Living wisdom is a tradition that actually helps people navigate the complexities of life, build stronger families, or find deeper meaning. You preserve that. Even if it seems old-fashioned, it serves a real psychological function. But dead power is a tradition that exists solely as an excuse for a specific group of people to maintain their dominance over others. If a tradition is just a mechanism for exclusion and control, with no life-giving wisdom behind it, you use the pruning shears. You cut it away.
That is a staggering way to evaluate our cultural fights. But there's a vulnerability in relying purely on tradition or progress to keep a society stable, because both of those assume the people in charge are acting in good faith. What happens when we introduce cold, hard resources into the equation? Because market dynamics do not care about your cultural traditions or your philosophical
They
ideals.
absolutely do not.
And that's the tension we step into now. We are moving into the machinations of power and scale. How do we deal with money, geography, and global systems? We are looking through the lenses of Liz, Tommy, and Kelly. Let's start with Liz. Her lens is regulation versus the free market.
Liz is a vital subpersonality because she completely strips away the moralizing that usually surrounds economics. She views the market not as an inherent moral good, nor as an inherent evil, but simply as a strategic game board where power is constantly moving.
And she delivers a paradox that perfectly explains why our economy always feels broken no matter who is in charge. It is a continuous loop. Here's how it works. Freedom decentralizes opportunity, but eventually it centralizes power.
Right.
Think about a brand new industry like the early days of the internet. It's a free market. Anyone in their garage can start a website. Opportunity is totally decentralized.
But the mechanics of a free market dictate that there will be winners and losers, and the winners scale up through economies of scale. They get more efficient, they generate more capital, and what do they do with that capital? They buy up their competitors. Over time, that completely decentralized garage startup ecosystem consolidates into 3 or 4 massive tech monopolies.
So freedom has decentralized the opportunity initially, but it eventually centralized the power into the hands of a few billionaires.
Exactly. At which point, the system becomes rigged. The monopolies use their massive wealth to build moats. They lower prices just long enough to bankrupt new competitors, then they jack them back up. So the public gets furious and demands regulation to break up that concentrated power. They want the government to step in and reset the board.
So the government passes massive regulatory reform, and here is where the second half of Liz's paradox kicks in. Regulation decentralizes power by breaking at the monopolies or forcing them to follow strict rules, but it eventually centralizes control in the hands of the bureaucracy.
That's the trap.
Walk me through the exact mechanics of that. How does regulation meant to hurt big business accidentally empower the government and sometimes, ironically, the big businesses themselves?
It's called regulatory capture, and it works like this. Imagine Congress passes a sweeping 2,000-page law to regulate the banking industry. The intent is to stop giant banks from taking reckless risks. But who actually understands a 2,000-page financial regulation?
Elite compliance lawyers.
Only armies of elite compliance lawyers. The massive Wall Street bank can afford to hire 500 lawyers to navigate the new rules. They survive. But this small, independent community bank in your hometown, they can't afford a compliance department. The sheer cost of navigating the regulation forces them to close down or sell themselves to the giant Wall Street bank.
Oh, wow. So the regulation, which was meant to leash the monopoly, acted as a protective moat that destroyed the small startups. The bureaucracy centralized control, and the monopoly survived anyway.
Exactly. It is a continuous breathing cycle. The optimal economic state isn't finding some static, magical middle ground where regulation and free markets perfectly balance forever.
There's no permanent fix.
No, the goal is to maintain the movement of the cycle so that power never becomes permanently entrenched in one place, whether that is a corporate boardroom or a federal regulatory agency. You need the market to innovate, and you need the regulator to bust the monopolies when they calcify again and again forever.
Which seamlessly links economic power to physical structural power. Where does the power actually sit geographically? That brings us to Tommy's lens. Centralization versus decentralization.
Tommy's paradox is elegant in its simplicity, but terrifying in its implications. A system that is easy to control is also extremely easy to break.
The framework uses a fantasy world-building analogy to explain this, and it's brilliant. Imagine two different realms. First, you have Castleguard. It is a highly centralized kingdom. There is one king, one unified army, one standard set of laws, one currency, and all the food is stored in the capital city. If a war starts, the king snaps his fingers, the orders go out instantly, and the entire kingdom moves as one cohesive unit. It is incredibly efficient. It is very easy to control.
But what is the vulnerability?
It is intensely brittle. If the king goes mad, the whole country suffers. If an assassin sneaks in and poisons the water supply of the capital city, or if a dragon burns down the central grain silo, the entire kingdom collapses overnight. A single point of failure destroys the whole system.
Now, contrast Castleguard with Thylanus. Thylanus is a decentralized forest populated by 50 independent nomadic clans. There is no central king. There is no capital city. They all have their own leaders, their own food supplies, and their own local customs.
Total decentralization.
Right. If an enemy army attacks the forest, it is incredibly inefficient. The clans don't communicate well. They might not even realize the clan on the other side of the forest is under attack. It is very hard to organize a unified defense.
Right. But what is its strength?
It is extraordinarily resilient. You cannot conquer Thylanus with a single strike. There is no capital city to burn. There is no single king to assassinate. You would have to fight 50 separate wars to conquer the forest. It is messy, it is inefficient, but it survives.
Okay, let me push back on this, because relying on a messy forest seems like a terrible way to run a modern civilization.
Right.
Is Tommy essentially saying that centralization acts like a single human brain, while decentralization acts like a swarm of bees?
That's an interesting way to put it.
Because a brain is highly intelligent, coordinated, and capable of complex thought. But a single bullet to the head kills the entire organism instantly. A swarm of bees is messy, uncoordinated, and chaotic, but you can't kill a swarm with a single bullet. They just disperse and reform. If that's the case, how can we possibly layer these two architectures to get the best of both worlds? We need the intelligence of the brain and the resilience of the swarm.
The analysis we are looking at provides a direct structural answer to that, which is the layered hybrid model. This is how successful nations actually survive. The golden rule is this. You centralize constraints and emergencies, but you strictly decentralize execution and adaptation.
I need to know how that works in practice.
Okay.
Give me an example of what we centralize.
You centralize power in areas where a failure to coordinate would be absolutely catastrophic. National defense is the obvious one. You do not want 50 independent state militias trying to negotiate their own nuclear treaties or foreign policies. That requires the unified brain.
That makes sense.
You also centralize a baseline of fundamental civil rights, because a healthy democracy cannot tolerate localized pockets of tyranny. You cannot have one state deciding that a specific minority group no longer has the right to vote. The central authority must enforce that constraint uniformly.
Okay, so you centralize the absolute floor of human rights and the absolute ceiling of existential threats. But where do you decentralize?
You decentralize execution in areas where wrong decisions from the top would cause widespread systemic damage and where local knowledge is infinitely more valuable than bureaucratic theory. A great example is local zoning laws or educational curriculums.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. If a local town hall tries out a bizarre new zoning law about where you can build commercial real estate and it completely fails and ruins their local economy, well, only that specific town suffers. And because the power is local, the angry citizens can just show up to the next town meeting, vote out the mayor, and fix the law immediately. It's a contained failure.
Okay.
But if a centralized federal government mandates a flawed, theoretical zoning law for the entire country simultaneously. You wreck the housing market nationwide, and it takes an act of Congress and a decade of lobbying to fix it.
Exactly. And the European Union attempts to formalize this through a concept called subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity dictates that political decisions should always be made at the lowest, most local level possible by municipalities or individual member nations unless the problem absolutely requires collective action from the central authority in Brussels. It is a constant tug of war to prevent the brittleness of over-centralization and the chaos of over-decentralization.
Which naturally zooms us out to the ultimate planetary scale of power. We're talking about Kelly's lens, globalism versus nationalism.
This is essentially centralization versus decentralization, just mapped onto the entire globe. The framework describes this as a fundamental tension between expansion and definition.
Right. Globalism is the human instinct for expansion. It seeks to expand the collective we, to include all of humanity. It looks at the borders drawn on maps and says, these are arbitrary fictions that separate us. The highest expression of this instinct is something like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
It's an incredible vision.
It is a breathtakingly ambitious blueprint for planetary coordination, ending extreme poverty globally, managing the oceans, tackling climate change as a unified species.
But the severe vulnerability of globalism is that as you expand the scale of governance, power becomes incredibly distant. It becomes rootless, abstract, and heavily technocratic.
Let's make that real. If you are a factory worker in Ohio whose plant is closing, or a farmer in France dealing with massive inflation on fertilizer, globalism feels like a threat.
Yeah.
You feel like your daily survival is being dictated by invisible, unelected bureaucrats sitting in a glass building in Geneva or Brussels who have absolutely zero understanding of what your life actually looks like. The empathy is stretched so thin it breaks.
Which brings us to the counterweight. Nationalism is the human instinct for definition. It intentionally shrinks the collective we down to a shared identity, a specific geographical border, a specific shared culture or language.
It bounds the community.
Yes. The immense appeal of nationalism is solidarity and direct accountability. You know exactly who your neighbors are, you know exactly who's in charge, and if the leader fails, you know exactly whose door to knock on. It bounds the community so that trust can actually form.
The terrifying risk of nationalism is tribalism. When you define who is us, you necessarily define who is them. It breeds hostility to outsiders, and practically speaking, it leads to a catastrophic failure to coordinate on issues that refuse to respect borders. A virus doesn't stop at a passport checkpoint. Carbon emissions don't care about national sovereignty.
What is truly revolutionary about Kelly's framework is that it completely refuses to frame this debate as a cartoonish battle between good, enlightened, caring globalists and bad, selfish, backward nationalists, or vice versa. Instead, it frames it as a deeply difficult debate over different ways of organizing care.
Organizing care, that is such a powerful phrase.
It fundamentally changes the conversation. It is a debate over where human empathy ends and practical responsibility begins. The globalist makes a moral argument. Care must be expanded to every human being on Earth to be truly legitimate. If you only care about people who look like you or live near you, your morality is stunted.
Right.
But the nationalist makes a practical argument. Care must be bounded to actually function. You can feel theoretical empathy for 8 billion people, but you can only effectively govern, tax, and protect the people within a defined, manageable system. If you try to be responsible for everyone, you end up protecting no one.
Wow. Okay. We have covered the massive tectonic plates of society, the structural forces, the economics, the global geography. Now, we have to bring this back down to the human scale. We are moving into the realm of moral calculations and the burden of leadership. How do we judge what is fair? How do we distribute rewards? We are looking at Tira, Devin, and Bannock. Let's start with Tira's lens. Equality versus merit.
This is undoubtedly the most emotionally charged tension we face because it dictates who gets status, who gets wealth, and who gets left behind. Tira's paradox cuts right to the heart of our deepest economic anxieties. The more equal you make the outcomes in a society, the less individual effort seems to matter.
Yes, that's the fear.
But conversely, a pure meritocracy can easily be used to launder privilege and attach moral virtue to arbitrary hierarchy.
Let's dive deep into the philosophical clash here, because it is fascinating. On the side of equality, you have John Rawls. We mentioned his veil of ignorance earlier, but his theory of justice goes deeper. Rawls essentially argued that almost everything that leads to success, your intelligence, your work ethic, the family you were born into, the country you were born in, is largely a matter of genetic and geographic lottery. It is luck.
Mostly out of our control.
Right. Therefore, he argued that inequality in a society is only morally justified if that inequality ultimately works to the maximum benefit of the least advantaged people. You could average doctors, but only if paying them a lot ensures the poor get better health care.
On the exact opposite side, representing the libertarian tradition of pure merit and property rights, you have Robert Nozick. Nozick rejected the idea that society is a pie that needs to be sliced equally by a central planner. His entitlement theory argued that justice is not about achieving a specific equal pattern at the end of the day. Justice is entirely about the process.
How does that work in his view?
Nozick argued that if wealth and property are acquired legitimately, meaning you didn't steal it, and transferred legitimately through voluntary exchange, meaning someone willingly paid you for your services, then any resulting inequality, no matter how massive, is perfectly just.
Oh, I see.
If millions of people voluntarily buy a ticket to watch a brilliant athlete play basketball, that athlete becomes a millionaire, and the fans get poorer by the price of the ticket. The outcome is highly unequal, but because every exchange was voluntary, it is entirely just. To step in and redistribute that wealth by force is, to Nozick, a violation of basic human rights.
The fear of forced equality is brilliantly captured in Kurt Vonnegut's dystopian short story, Harrison Bergeron. It perfectly illustrates the nightmare scenario of Tira's equality pole. In that story, the government decides that to achieve total fairness, no one can be better than anyone else at anything. So they enforce equality through physical handicaps.
It's a terrifying concept.
It is. If you're naturally beautiful, you have to wear an ugly mask. If you are naturally intelligent, you have to wear a loud earpiece that blasts noise every few seconds to interrupt your thoughts. If you are a graceful ballet dancer, you have to wear heavy bags of birdshot padlocked to your body so you stumble around like everyone else.
It is equality achieved through absolute subtraction. It destroys excellence and crushes the human spirit just to ensure no one feels inferior.
But wait, I need to play devil's advocate here and push back on the pure merit side. Because Nozick's voluntary exchange sounds incredibly fair in a vacuum. But in the real world, a pure meritocracy seems to just launder privilege. If society claims to be a pure meritocracy, it sends a psychological message to the billionaire that their success is 100% their own doing. It completely ignores the inherited wealth, the elite zip code, the private tutors, and the stable two-parent home they benefited from.
It ignores the head start.
Exactly. And much worse, it tells the person living in generational poverty that their failure is entirely their own fault. It turns economic inequality from an accident of birth into a brutal moral judgment on a person's soul.
That is precisely the vulnerability of meritocracy. It assumes a level playing field that almost never exists. So how does Tara synthesize these two competing moral demands? The framework suggests that equality is necessary to protect the dignity of persons. It declares that every human being deserves a baseline of respect, healthcare, and survival simply by virtue of existing. But merit is necessary to protect the dignity of agency.
The dignity of agency.
Yes, it declares that your choices, your late nights, your hard work, and your sacrifices have to actually mean something and yield a reward.
So what is the practical mechanism to balance them?
The ultimate synthesis is this. A healthy societal system must aggressively equalize what people cannot control and clearly differentiate what they can control.
I see the logic,
Yeah.
but how do we actually separate the two in the real world? Isn't effort largely dictated by your starting conditions? I mean, if you grow up malnourished or with severe childhood trauma, your brain literally doesn't have the biological capacity for the same sustained effort or executive function as someone who grew up safe and well-fed. So how do we separate uncontrollable luck from controllable effort?
It is the hardest policy needle to thread. Practically, it means society must focus massively on the starting line rather than the finish line. You equalize the uncontrollable by ensuring universal access to prenatal care, high-quality early childhood nutrition, safe neighborhoods, and equally funded schools. You try to absorb the shock of bad luck early on. And once you have genuinely leveled the foundation, then you allow merit to differentiate the outcomes based on risk-taking, discipline, and innovation. You can never separate them perfectly, but the attempt is what makes the system just.
Equalize the uncontrollable, differentiate the controllable.
Well,
Okay, moving to Devon's lens. Security versus privacy. So what does this all mean? This is a darker perspective dealing with the raw mechanics of state power, but it is absolutely necessary.
Devon's paradox is structural, mechanical, and totally unavoidable. Safety requires visibility, freedom requires opacity.
Explain the mechanics of that. Why are they locked in a zero-sum conflict?
Because of how information works. If you want a system to perfectly protect you, whether from a domestic terrorist plot, a global pandemic, or a financial scam, that system needs data. It needs to be able to see everything. It needs mass surveillance, contact tracing on your phone, biometric border controls, and access to your financial transactions to spot anomalies. To keep you safe, the state requires absolute visibility into your life.
But if you want freedom, the freedom to speak dissenting political opinions without fear of retaliation, the freedom to organize a protest, or simply the freedom to live without the psychological weight of being constantly monitored, you require opacity. You literally need dark spaces where the state's cameras and algorithms cannot see you. You need encrypted messaging. You need physical privacy.
What is truly insightful about Devon's lens is how it exposes the psychological bias in how we debate these issues. The framework points out that privacy absolutists evaluate new systems entirely by their potential for abuse.
Ah, I see.
When a government introduces a new facial recognition law, the privacy advocate looks at it and thinks, how could a dictator use this exact same technology in 15 years to hunt down political rivals?
Right. But security advocates evaluate that exact same system by its intended use. They look at the facial recognition law and think, this is going to help us identify and catch a human trafficker at the airport tomorrow afternoon.
They are speaking two completely different languages. One is focused on long-term systemic risk. The other is focused on immediate, tangible harm reduction.
So how do we ever reach an agreement? Because we all want to be safe, but nobody wants to live in an Orwellian surveillance state.
Devon's ultimate truth on this is incredibly cynical, but historically it is deadly accurate. The reality is that almost no one actually believes purely in security or privacy as abstract, inviolable concepts. What you actually believe in is the people who hold the power, and your stance shifts based entirely on how much you trust them.
Oof, that cuts deep. But it's true. I mean, if my preferred political party is in charge of the intelligence agencies in the military, I might be perfectly fine with expanded surveillance powers because I implicitly trust my team to use those powers against the bad guys. I want security.
Yes, exactly.
But the very second the opposing party wins the election and takes control of the exact same agencies and the exact same databases, suddenly my threat model flips. Suddenly, I am a passionate, uncompromising defender of privacy and civil liberties.
Exactly. Your fundamental moral values didn't actually change overnight. Your perception of the threat changed based on who was holding the weapon.
Okay, we need a way to navigate all of these competing moral demands. We have the individual versus the collective, tradition versus progress, equality versus merit. How does a leader actually steer a society through this storm? That brings us to Bannock's lens. Idealism versus pragmatism. Bannock provides the framework for actual leadership.
Bannock's framework is elegantly presented as the captain's dilemma. Imagine you are the captain of a ship responsible for hundreds of souls, and you are steering through a terrifying, violent storm. You have two primary options for how to navigate.
Option one is following the stars. This is the path of idealism. You refuse to compromise your destination. You know true north is where you need to go, and you keep the ship pointed directly at true north, no matter how bad the storm gets or how high the waves crash.
It's pure conviction.
The moral purity is intoxicating. But the massive risk is that the waves are too rough for that exact heading, and your rigid adherence to the ideal causes the ship to capsize. You preserve your moral purity to the very end, but your entire crew drowns.
Option two is following the storm. This is the path of pragmatism. You abandon the stars and adjust your course entirely based on whatever keeps the ship afloat in the immediate, terrifying moment. You turn into the waves, you make endless compromises just to survive the next 5 minutes.
But you lose your way.
Right. The risk here is that you do survive the storm, but when the clouds clear, you are thousands of miles off course in the middle of nowhere. You have completely abandoned your principles and forgotten where you were even trying to go. You survive, but you lose your purpose.
The historical examples are so crucial here to understand how this works in real life. Let's look at the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the United States. It is a masterclass in the tension between idealism and pragmatism. The idealism came from the activists, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the marchers in Selma, the students at the lunch counters. They were following the stars. They provided the absolute unyielding moral clarity, insisting that segregation was an abomination that had to end immediately without compromise.
They created the necessary pressure. But pressure doesn't automatically write laws.
Right. Getting the actual legislation passed through a deeply divided Congress required intense, messy, and sometimes ugly pragmatism. It required President Lyndon B. Johnson navigating the storm. He had to engage in backroom deals, horse trading, and brutal legislative maneuvering to break the Southern senators' filibuster. He had made compromises on certain enforcement mechanisms just to get the votes to pass the core of the bill.
The idealism of the movement provided the destination, but the pragmatism of the politician built the actual vessel to get there. Another example is the New Deal during the Great Depression. Franklin D. Roosevelt wasn't operating on pure ideological purity, he was throwing spaghetti at the wall. It was emergency pragmatism aimed at preventing total economic collapse and mass starvation. Some programs worked, some were unconstitutional, but the goal was keeping the ship afloat.
Let me push back on this framework because while it sounds majestic in a historical retrospective, it is agonizing in the present moment. If idealism without pragmatism is wishful cruelty because you let real people suffer today while you hold out for a perfect utopian solution tomorrow, and pragmatism without idealism is orderly decay because you just manage a corrupt system efficiently without ever trying to fix it, how does a leader actually act on a random Tuesday? When a mayor or a CEO or a parent is faced with a terrible choice, what is the actual psychological mechanism for making a decision?
The mechanism is what Bannock calls the compass. Ideals define the direction, but pragmatism dictates the navigation. In actual practice, this means a mature leader will frequently and intentionally allow small, painful compromises in the present in order to prevent a massive catastrophic harm. You take a 60% victory today rather than suffering a 100% defeat while waiting for perfection.
You tune the ship slightly off course to avoid the rogue wave.
Yes, but here is the critical defining mechanism that saves the soul of the leader and prevents pragmatism from turning into pure corruption. The leader must never, ever stop noticing that it was a compromise.
Explain that.
The psychological trap is rationalization. The moment you make a pragmatic compromise, say you agree to a flawed climate bill because it's the only one that can pass, and you start giving speeches convincing yourself and everyone else that this flawed bill was actually your ideal, perfect outcome all along, that is the moment you have lost your way. The internal friction, the discomfort, the quiet acknowledgement that we fell short of the ideal today in order to survive, and it hurts, and we must fight to do better tomorrow. That active noticing is the only thing that keeps the soul alive. The guilt is the compass.
That is incredibly profound. The guilt is the compass. Okay, we have explored the entire map of human tension. Now, we're going to pull all of these threads together to see the meta pattern. How do these 10 subpersonalities manifest in the real world right now? We are going to look at how this maps onto modern political parties. And I want to be explicitly clear to you, the listener, we're not endorsing these political platforms. We're merely reporting the objective analysis of the original author's framework. But what's fascinating about looking at American politics through this specific framework is that you realize neither party is actually the pure party of freedom or the pure party of rules. They aren't hypocrites. They just apply these paradoxes to entirely different domains of human life.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, if you track the DNA of these tensions, you see a distinct architectural pattern in both platforms.
Let's trace it. Historically and structurally, U.S. Republicans tend to lean heavily toward Liz's free market pole, arguing that regulation suffocates growth. They lean toward Val's respect for tradition, believing cultural continuity stabilizes society. And they heavily index on Addy's individualist pole, prioritizing the protection of the individual entrepreneur or citizen against the overreach of the collective state.
Right, that's their baseline.
U.S. Democrats, conversely, tend to build their architecture around Tyra's equality of outcome, trying to level the economic playing field. They lean toward Kelly's globalism, focusing on international climate treaties and broad human rights. And they rely heavily on Addy's collectivist pole, believing that a robust social safety net and collective scaffolding are required for true human flourishing.
But the true genius of the framework is that it reveals the hidden crisscross beneath the surface. It shows us that both sides are utilizing the exact same tools, just in inverted ways.
Walk us through the crisscross.
Let's look at Bannock's idealism versus pragmatism. Modern progressive movements utilize intense, burning idealism for their moral framing. Healthcare is a fundamental human right. We must save the planet from immediate destruction. The rhetoric is pure stars. But when it comes to execution, they rely on incredibly dense, technocratic pragmatism. They want to build massive administrative bureaucracies, write thousands of pages of tax code, and utilize highly complex regulatory levers to achieve those idealistic goals.
And the conservative movement inverts it. They use intense pragmatism in their policy framing, arguing that government bureaucracies are inherently inefficient, that complex taxes stall the engine of the economy, and that local markets allocate resources better than central planners. It's a pragmatic argument about efficiency.
Yeah,
But they
exactly.
hold fierce, unbending, almost religious idealism regarding concepts like constitutional liberty, the right to bear arms, and national sovereignty.
The crisscross is even more obvious when you look at max freedom versus authority. Progressives generally demand maximum unconstrained freedom in the realms of personal identity, bodily autonomy, and social expression. They want the referee to put the whistle away, but they demand strong, centralized authority and heavy regulation over the economy, corporations, and the environment.
And conservatives demand maximum, unconstrained freedom in the economy and business low taxes, deregulation. But they frequently desire stronger authority and stricter rules to maintain traditional cultural norms, public order, and national borders.
So everyone wants freedom for the things they value and authority for the things they fear. Which leads us to the ultimate master insight of this entire deep dive. The exhausting, intense polarization we experience every single day, the arguments at the Thanksgiving table, the vitriol on social media, is not actually a simple disagreement on what the top marginal tax rate should be, or a debate over a specific line of policy. It is a fundamental psychological disagreement on which danger is more imminent.
This changes how you view every political debate. You have to look at the threat model. When a progressive looks out at society, they see a system that is stagnating. They see entrenched wealth inequality, marginalized groups suffering, and a climate crisis being ignored. To them, the imminent existential danger is the status quo. The house is slowly filling with carbon monoxide. Therefore, aggressive change, systemic disruption, and forced equality are absolute moral imperatives to save the house.
But when a conservative looks out at the exact same society, they see a completely different threat model. They see ancient, fragile institutions, family structures, and cultural cohesion fraying under the weight of rapid, untested technological and social changes. To them, the imminent existential danger is systemic collapse. The load-bearing beams of the house are being carelessly sawed in half. Therefore, enforcing stability, protecting tradition, and maintaining order are absolute moral imperatives to prevent the roof from caving in.
They aren't just arguing about the blueprint of the house. They are reacting to two completely different existential panics. And because they are reacting to what feels like a literal threat to survival, compromise feels not just difficult, but actively treasonous.
Hmm.
To the progressive, compromising with the status quo is complicity in ongoing injustice. To the conservative, compromising with rapid chaotic change is inviting the destruction of everything they hold dear.
So to wrap up this massive exploration, what these 10 subpersonalities, Addy, Mac, Kenny, Val, Liz, Tommy, Kelly, Devin, Tira, and Bannock ultimately show us is that tension is not a sign of failure in a society.
It's not a bug.
No, the arguments are not a bug in the system. Tension is the actual structure holding the society up. It is the physics of the guitar string. If one side completely defeats the other, if one side pulls so hard that the opposition vanishes, the string snaps, the music stops, the system collapses. We literally need the progressives to keep the system from rotting from stagnation. And we need the conservatives to keep the system from exploding into chaos. We need the individual to innovate and the collective to care.
And this realization shouldn't just change how you view politics. It changes how you live. Because these aren't just massive, abstract policies debated by politicians in capitals. These are the exact same micro-tensions you navigate in your own daily life. When you are arguing with your partner over whether to finally confront a toxic family member about their bad behavior, you are navigating Kenny's tension of stability versus change. Do you risk the chaos of a fight to repair the relationship?
When you manage a team at work and you have to decide how strictly to monitor their hours versus letting them work autonomously to foster creativity, you are navigating max tension of authority versus freedom. When you are trying to figure out how to balance your children's needs with your own personal career ambitions, you are agonizing over Addy's tension of the collective versus the individual.
It is all the exact same underlying math. We are all just trying to tune the guitar. So I want to end by dropping a final lingering thought, inspired directly by the architecture we've just decoded. Something for you to mull over the next time you find yourself in a heated debate. Think about your own deepest political or social conviction, the belief you feel most fiercely in your gut, the one you would defend to the end. Now ask yourself this: is it possible that the side you fight against the hardest is the exact counterweight keeping your own ideals from destroying themselves? Do you honor where you came from, or do you become who you are? Keep diving deep, and we'll see you next time.